Ladies and gentlemen, when I was invited to present a paper about the paintings of Bawit, I felt a bit reluctant to accept, simply because I am not part of the mission that has been excavating here, neither at the beginning of the 20th century, neither at the beginning of the 21st century. And to be honest, I never even visited the site myself, and I thought that it would be the duty of somebody who was better involved in the whole material. But nevertheless, since unfortunately our colleagues from the Louvre are not here, I have accepted the invitation. But I would like to make, of course, a few remarks before I start. I think there are some serious impediments that keep us from drawing conclusions right now on the basis of the material that we have from Bawit. First of all, and here I'm showing you the plan of the site as it has been drawn up by Torp before the resumption of the fieldwork by the French mission. As you can see, only a small part of the site has been excavated, an estimated 5%. And of this 5%, large parts were excavated by Cléda, Maspero, and colleagues with methods that are not anymore the methods we would use nowadays. We are still left with lots of questions concerning the exact location of certain objects, etc. And the publication leaves many questions unanswered in spite of the valuable editions that were published by Dominique Benazet and Anne Boudor in 1999. So that means what I'll be presenting now is based on very shallow foundations. And that is, well, just preliminary remarks I would like to make. The questions that are remaining are many. For instance, the structure of the settlement. What we have now is remains of buildings that are scattered over a wide area, and as you have seen, the connection between these buildings is far from clear. Has there been a perimeter wall around the complex? If so, what was its function, etc., etc. Then we are still puzzled about the exact functions of certain buildings. I'll come back to that. In many of the buildings, mural paintings have been found, and although they can be identified when it comes to their subject and theme, that doesn't mean that they are iconographically clear to us, and especially not in connection with the function of the rooms where they have been found. Who made them? Who commissioned them? We can see from the quality of the paintings that they were not the work of amateurs and probably not by the people who were living there, but amongst themselves, but were made by painters who had seen more of the world than just Upper Egypt and surroundings. The subject matter and the style betray influence from late antique paintings, even though the style itself could be called local or provincial. But they fit in a much larger, much wider picture, and it's in this context that I would like to put some of these paintings. First of all, we have a number of rooms that you have seen already before. The so-called salles, as he called them, excavated by Maspero. And this is a part of it, a tentative reconstruction of the complex of 1, 5, and 6 with surrounding areas. An elongated room with elaborate mural decoration and an apse in the eastern wall, which suggests that it was not just an ordinary cell, but a room which was meant for gatherings of groups of monks. Two parallel rooms which suggest that at a certain moment room 6, which is the oldest one, was not large enough and gradually extended by surrounding rooms. What was the function of such a room if there were also churches? Were they meant for the liturgy of the hours to be used in between the liturgy celebrated in the church, for instance? This is a possibility, but the question remains unanswered yet. Then there are complexes numbered in Latin numbers by Cléda and called chapelle by him. And that was still from the presumption that he was dealing with a necropolis and that the buildings he was excavating were in fact funerary chapels. Well, this misunderstanding has been corrected by Maspero, who instead used the term of salle, since he was not able to locate one tomb underneath the so-called chapelle of Cléda. But of course, now that we have just seen that there are tombs underneath the basilica, that means that a cemetery has at least not been far, and if more excavations would take place in this area, who knows what will be found at deeper levels. Take for instance one of the complexes here, and these are the chapelle numbered from 41 to 49 that we have here in detail. This looks more like a complex of cells. These rooms are all on ground floor level, but the stairs that you see in several places suggest that they had at least one story, and that we are dealing here with living quarters gradually expanded over a certain period. What about the function of the buildings? As I said, many questions remained, and of course we have to suppose, I think, that at least a large part of them were used as living quarters for the monks living here, and not tombs. Cléda called them chapelle, Maspero corrected it and called them salle. Severin, in his lemma in the Coptic Encyclopedia, more or less confirms these opinions, but also adds that much more research will be possible to come to a final conclusion, and that it's still not excluded that, as in the case of, for instance, the monastery of Apa Jeremia in Saqqara, the monastic settlement has been built on top of an earlier necropolis. One article published by Torp in the 1957 edition of Byzantium seems to have gone widely unnoticed, because so far I haven't found reference to it in most of the publication concerning Bawit. And I think that is undeserved, since what he does is, on one hand, of course, confirming the misunderstanding of Cléda that it is certainly not a cemetery, but on the other hand, he notices that the architecture of the cells in Bawit has a certain similarity with late antique, early Christian tomb architecture in its construction, and that there might be reasons to look for a connection between tomb architecture and the cells in Bawit. These are two illustrations from Torp, and I don't know what went wrong, but there was meant to be a second cross-section on the right-hand side as a comparison, but apparently it has dropped off somewhere. But anyway, what you see on the left-hand side is a cross-section of a tomb with cut in the rock with a mud brick vault. What we see in many of the constructions of the vaults, as the remains have been found in Bawit, is a similar way of constructing a vault, but not in order to support the first floor on top of it, since for the support of the first floor, beams were used. In other words, the vault did not really serve a constructive purpose of supporting the first floor and could have been omitted since there were beams to support this first floor. In other words, and this is the conclusion of Thorpe, the vaults may have been intended to evoke the construction of a tomb, so that many of these so-called chapelles and salles have been functioning as commemorative chapels and not simply only as living quarters, which have been located on the first floor of these buildings. Well, for instance, in salle number 1, we see such a construction here with a later addition of an eastern a niche at the eastern side. But this, in fact, is such an example of a vault which has partially survived. Thorpe compares the construction of the cells with the better preserved tombs that have been found in Tuna Gallery, where we also see that vaults are located on the ground floor level, while the first floor is constructed on top of these. So the questions that arose to me is that if Thorpe has a point in comparing the cells of the chapelle in a constructive aspect to tombs, is there also a connection in the iconography that supports the supposition of Thorpe? And if so, what is the background of the funerary character of the so-called chapelle, if they are not to be identified as tombs? I have taken a slightly closer look at a number of themes that occur and reoccur in a number of the rooms at Bawit, and have taken the liberty of comparing them to themes and representations from late antique Mediterranean culture. You might find this far-fetched, but I think since we are able to conclude that, for instance, also in Sohag, in the decoration of the red and white monastery, we see a very clear inspiration from Eastern Mediterranean culture, late Roman architecture, for instance, it would not be too far-fetched and look for comparison in a wider context. One of the puzzling themes are the hunting scenes that we find in a number of cells in Bawit. For instance, in Chapelle 18, you see here the black and white pictures, and here the aquarelle, which shows a decorative pattern with in between octagonal fields with small man hunting gazelles. It looks like an entirely non-religious decoration, a kind of wall painting imitated from Roman mosaics, for instance, but it would be difficult to find an immediate religious explanation for these themes. In another location, for instance, in Chapelle 12, we find a hunting scene on the northern wall of one of the smaller rooms, and this is the well-known representation of the hunting of a lion, as the inscription clearly states. Betsy Bowman has been interpreting these hunting scenes and the representation of wild animals in general as a metaphor for the spiritual struggle of the monk with the forces of evil. And of course this is, I think, a possibility, since, for instance, also Christ trampling on the animals, based on the Psalms, the lion, the basilisk, the snake, as kind of images of evil that has to be fought by the monk. I think it's an acceptable explanation, but we might look for a second layer of meaning. Wherever we encounter certain themes here in the iconography, I think we might not always be satisfied with one single interpretation, but we might look for a multiple layer of meaning. In chapel 37, we find an even more elaborate scene of the hunt of a gazelle, now involving several people. Unfortunately, the rest of the painting is missing. At least I have not found any other representation of it. And also here, a direct religious meaning seems difficult to find if we don't see it as a metaphor for chasing evil. But then, could a gazelle be seen as an image of evil? I would ask myself. So maybe here we should ask for other explanations. Battle scenes and hunting scenes have been popular subject material for pre-Christian Roman tombs. And here I show you two examples chosen at random from the 3rd century, where we see the hunting of boars and a lion on Roman non-Christian sarcophagi. Several themes can occur in Roman funerary iconography, some of them dealing with the hope of a life after death, others with heroic deeds which will immortify the owner of the sarcophagus, and these includes, for instance, battle scenes and also hunting scenes, which are an image of bravery and male power. A parallel that might be slightly closer to what we find in Bawit is this tomb that has been excavated in the 19th century by Rostovtsev in what is now Ukraine, the town of Tantikapion. And here we see a layout which is quite comparable to what you find in Bawit. That is a dado zone, a lower decorated zone with imitation of stone inlay and columns, and on top a frieze with, again, a hunting scene. Another subject that occurs a number of times is the so-called imago clipiata. On the eastern wall of chapel 18, we have a prayer niche, as we find them in several chapels, of course, and not only in Bawit. And in the surrounding decoration, there were the remains of two angels carrying a clipius decorated with gems. Most probably what we have here is a representation of the portrait of Christ being lifted by angels. And of course you all know this painting, which was excavated in the 1970s by the Supreme Council and is now in the Coptic Museum. A similar representation of the clipius with the portrait of Christ lifted by angels. The clipius, the round panel on which a portrait is painted, is the classical shape of the ancestors' portraits in late Roman culture, and such portraits were kept in the house in the so-called Ahnen Gallery, the ancestors' gallery, where the portraits of the deceased members of the family were kept. But on the other hand, we also find, apart from, for instance, these representations, again from Bawit, where two saints are represented in such a clipius, we find it as a decoration on Roman sarcophagi, here as an image of the apotheosis, the lifting to heaven of the deceased, not by angels, because here we are not looking at Christian sarcophagi, but pre-Christian ones, or let's say non-Christian ones. The Jenny lifting the portrait of the deceased to eternity. Another theme that occurs frequently in Coptic art in general, but also in a monastic context, context is the theme of the three men in the fiery furnace. This is the well-known picture of Saal 30 from Bawit, where, unlike most other representations, the three men are now carried by the angel instead of standing in front of him or behind him. And also here we see that if we compare it to, in this case, Christian Roman sarcophagi, representations of the three men in the furnace in early 4th century sarcophagi. Here, by the way, you see that the central clipius in the lid of this sarcophagi on top has never been filled in, but was probably meant to carry either a cross or a representation of the owner of the sarcophagus. It also frequently occurs in the paintings of the Roman catacombs, and here it fits in a series of themes that have been derived from the so-called Commendatio Animae, the prayers that were said for the dead, and in which a number of themes from all the New Testament were brought in connection with the salvation of the soul of the deceased. So the prayer runs more or less like, God have mercy on the soul of our brother so-and-so, as you have saved Daniel from the lion's den, in the way that you have saved the three men from the fiery furnace. So it is a metaphor for the salvation of the soul after death, and that explains its funerary meaning. In Wadi Sarga, in a building that has not been well explained since its context is missing, and it was excavated in just the last days of the season, we find a representation of the three men in the furnace in the central part of this painting, surrounded by the saints Cosmas and Damien, and three martyrs, standing with raised hand in a gesture of prayer, a way that is often used for saints, again, in a funerary context. From the execution of the paintings, it is likely that it was not a composition which was made at once, but where certain elements were gradually added. I don't have enough information about this painting to judge whether, for instance, the three martyrs standing below are contemporary with Cosmas and Damien, but what certainly has been added are the three faces next to the panel with the three men, which in a graffito style have later been added to the picture. In this case, we might be dealing with a painting from a funerary chapel or from a monk cell, but as I told you, the context of the painting has not been investigated any further, so both things might be the case. Please pay attention to the three graffito-like heads that have been added, because this is a phenomenon that we can also witness in the rooms from Bawit, but also, for instance, on the walls of churches. I'll come back to this aspect later. In Saqqara we find the three men in the furnace in one of the chapels, one of the first ones, excavated by Quibel. And as I said, here we might draw a parallel between monastic decoration of cells and funerary themes. We find also graffiti with the names of the three men. And here, for instance, I have just copied one example of such graffiti added in one of the cells in Bawit. And, well, that might, of course, again, fit in the line of funerary themes. On the other hand, there is also, for instance, this apophthegma where the cell of the monk is compared to the fiery furnace of Babylon, the cell where the monk dwells, being tried by God in order to reach salvation, and that is another explanation for the frequently occurring theme in Coptic painting, I think. Then there is a number of decorative patterns that occurs in the paintings in Bawit, which again we could compare to paintings from funerary context. So coming back again to this painting from Chapel 17. Here we have a 4th century ceiling from a Roman tomb in Jordan, where exactly the same pattern has been used, now filled in with gorgons' heads and various animals. But also in a Christian context, like here in the so-called New Vatican, the new catacomb of the Via Latina, this pattern occurs as a decoration for one of the ceilings. In this case, pagan cubiculum, whereas other cubicula in the same catacomb are of a Christian character. And here in this cubiculum, which is dedicated to the deeds of Hercules, we see a ceiling with again the same kind of decoration with crosses and octagons. Of course, we find these decorative patterns not only in a funerary context but also in floor mosaics from Roman houses. We are not dealing here with entirely funerary themes. But then, for instance, if we look at certain minor subjects from the decorations, such as grapevines, fruit bowls, and animals, plants and trees, we see that if they occur in a funerary context, as in, for instance, this detail from the San Sebastiano catacomb in Rome, they are meant to evoke a paradise-like background for the dead, for the tombs, whereas, of course, the vine leaves here, the grapevines, are meant as a metaphor for the death of Christ, his resurrection, and the Eucharist. And similar minor elements, which might be, of course, entirely meaningless or coincidence, we find also back in the chapels of Bawit, like the little birds and the combination of branches and grapevines. A comparison with a recently found chapel where there can be no doubt about its character, the so-called Schulkap chapel of Luther near the White Monastery. Here we are dealing with an underground chapel with a small church, or let's say tomb underground, with a memorial chapel on ground level. So what we have here is a number of decorations which no doubt fit in a funerary context. We found gazelles. Here, for instance, at the back wall, 2 gazelles flanking a cross, which is now mostly disappeared. Gazelles which also occur in frequent spots in Bawit. On the walls, amidst the geometrical decorations, gazelles and crosses, we have a number of representations of eagles. Eagles with the mysterious colors around the neck, from which sometimes one, sometimes more ornaments are hanging, crosses, circles. These are eagles which also frequently occur, for instance, in funerary stelae in Egypt and Nubia. On one of the walls, the standing figure of Shenute has been found, flanked by other figures, and this has been taken as evidence by the excavators that we are dealing here with the tomb of Shenute. I think that, of course, this is not to be excluded, but on the other hand, the presence of Shenute in these paintings is not a proof, I think, that it was actually his tomb. And for this comparison, I would like to go back to the iconography of Bawit, where we also find numerous representations of saints from a far and recent past on the walls. But first of all, I would like to draw attention to the fact that a portrait in late antique and early Christian context is more than just a portrait the way that we can experience it, but it can have a representative function, and here representative in the sense of making a person present through his portrait. A late antique example is the triptych from Egypt, now in the Getty Museum, where we see the deceased flanked by Isis and Serapis, who are apparently meant to be protecting the person. Such portraits may have been painted already during lifetime, as in, for instance, the case of the so-called Fayum portraits, and only at the moment of death they were cut to size and attached to the body to function as a mummy portrait. It's possible that likewise in the Christian traditions, commemorative portraits were already painted during the life of certain people, whether they were dignitaries such as bishops or private persons, in order to start functioning as a commemorative portrait once the once portrayed had died. And this might be the case for instance, the famous icons of Bishop Abraham now in Berlin, and the icon of Christ and Father Minas in the Louvre. Also from Nubian church decoration we know that bishops under the protection of saints were represented already once they had been enthroned, and after death their portrait could be kept as a kind of commemorative or cult portrait. So in Bawit we find a series of such representations. For instance, the famous painting with Apollo as the founder of the community, flanked by saints and seated on a throne in a place of honor. A situation comparable to this more damaged painting from chapel number 3, where we also see a number of saints seated on a central throne, while others, of which two may have been monks, although the smallest one here at the side looks like a person from a non-monastic circles, judging from the dress that he or she is wearing. In other words, combinations of saints and living persons have been found in several places. And here the painting with a number of monks with the detail of the gazelle that I showed you on the previous slides. Also in Saqqara, which in its layout is in some respects very much comparable to Bawit, we see such a representation again of Apollo in the company of other saints, with a supplicant, in other words, a person apparently still alive at the moment the painting was made. It might have been the one who commissioned the painting represented. In Roman catacombs, we find similar compositions where members of a family are represented around a niche, in this case, of course, a niche containing a tomb. And also here I would like to draw your attention to the themes that we find in Bawit, such as the branches, the birds, and especially the peacocks, a symbol of incorruptibility and eternal life, that we also find in, for instance, the famous painting of Theodosia that we have already seen today, originating from Innemee. Also she is here represented under the protection of two saints, Saint Coluthos and Saint Maria. And while the peacocks not only occur as flanking dead or living persons, but also the cross, as in the case of Chapel 19 from Bawit. Such paintings have been found on western walls of cells, not only on western walls, but in any place where apparently some surface of the wall was left and was available for representations. And yeah, for instance, here in Chapel 26, the western wall is dedicated to a number of persons and saints. Only this aquarelle survives, so it's difficult to judge whether these persons have been represented at the same time, or whether we are dealing here with a composition that has been built up gradually, adding one person to the other. And this phenomenon of having monastic saints represented on the western wall of a sanctuary is also something that we find in an ecclesiastical context, like here in Del Surian, where a saint that might be identified with Saint Macarius is represented on one column, while Apollo from Bawit is painted on the other column. Again, Apollo, apparently as an important representative of Middle Egyptian monasticism, while the other saint is dressed in the costume of northern monks. In other words, what we have here are two representatives of Egyptian monasticism from different regions, facing east, and when the monks would be standing in a row for prayer or for liturgy in the gurus, they would be, as it were, facing the east in the company of their monastic predecessors and their spiritual ancestors. In this case, we see that the community worshipping in the church joins the paintings, or vice versa. The persons represented in a gesture of prayer on the wall become one with the community that is worshipping at that moment. And this could lead to this conclusion that the chapel, or the oratory, to use this term for the chapels that we are dealing with here in Bawit, are a place where earth and heaven meet. I mean, this is something we can say for any church or chapel, of course. But what we see is also that the living monks and their deceased ancestors are here reunited in praise of God. So it is the representations of the monks, and here by absent I mean the ones who are absent by death and the ones who are absent since they have been visitors once and have left their graffito on the wall and intend to be represented there forever through their graffito. They all together form the community that is united in worship here. And that means that this cell or chapel combines a double function. On one hand, it is a place where the dead and living monks are reunited, and where, on the other hand, the prayers are being said as they are said in church as well. And here we come to the question how we could explain the funerary character of these cells. The cells as a metaphor for the tomb where the monk lives. One apophthegma mentions the construction of tombs for the monks, not in a metaphorical, but in a literal way. A father and his apprentice go to Egypt. They notice that in the town of Puno, the people are going out to commemorate their dead and to lament over them, and the elder one decides to build tombs for themselves to lament the miserable state of their own souls. And if we go further into the investigation of the relationship between the monk and the tomb, we found several aspects that can be complementary to each other. As we have seen in Gertrud van Loon's presentation, whole monastic communities could be housed in cemeteries, and that might have been from a double purpose. The convenience of having ready-made housing, cool, only requiring slight adaptations to be inhabitable. But on the other hand, we also know that living in a tomb, living in the cemetery, is a confrontation with the forces of evil. The desert, by tradition, is a place where you'd better stay away at night, of course, from pharaonic times. And we know from several stories, like for instance the famous story of Macarius, who is facing the ghost of a pagan priest when he sleeps on his mummy that he uses as a sort of headrest. We know that the pagan tomb is a place of spiritual struggle. On the other hand, the monk, once he has said farewell to the world, has declared himself dead, not only because he has severed all the ties with his family and has given away his possessions, but he has also said farewell to most of his biological existence and his worldly passions, which make him dead to the world. Also something which is illustrated in a well-known apophthegm by Saint Macarius, where he is instructing a young monk. Well, like this we could find more quotations, like for instance the 11th apophthegm of Moses, where he preaches the death and, let's say, literally living in a tomb as the way of living for a monk. And in the apophthegm of Pimen, we see that he also uses the image of the tomb as a metaphor for the cell where the monk lives in tears and compunction, as it is translated. Coming to a conclusion, and I think a conclusion is a big word, as I said in the beginning, because what are we talking about so far? We don't have enough material, at least from Bawit, to build sound statistics upon. So I would like to call it, at least here when it comes to the iconography of Bawit, a working hypothesis. That on one hand the so-called chapelle are part of the living quarters of the monks, of which maybe only in many cases only the ground floor level has survived, which have been used for a double purpose, for the private prayers of one of the monks or a group of monks living together, but in their decoration referring both to liturgical aspects as to the place as a symbolic tomb where the monk lives and where he commemorates his ancestors. The themes depicted here show a familiarity of the painters with late antique art from the Eastern Mediterranean, something which need not be surprising if we compare the situation in, for instance, the decoration of monasteries in Sohar. And finally, the funerary character of the decoration underlines the already well-known metaphor that the monk, in fact, has said farewell to the world. He is dead for the world, of course, not yet completely physically dead, but is preparing himself for a life in eternity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your comprehensive study about the art in Bawit. And I believe that studying all the monasteries in Egypt will help us to understand and to date the Coptic art. So we have 10 minutes for questions, please.
I have just three comments, but I don't know what's worse. First, let us start from the end to the beginning. I was a little bit amazed to find that the two saints are Macarius and Apollo, rather, for example, somebody like Anthony or Paco. And I think the links between the two, that Saint Macarius is known that he never judged anybody, and Apollo is a monastery of Metanu. That means these two saints support people to enter after that to the sanctuary. And that's why these two saints are chosen. I don't know what's all this theory, but it's just an idea. The other thing, the gazelle and the serpent, I think that it is mentioned in the book of the Physiologos, which was published by Van Lanskut in the Coptic Studies in honor of Walter Aaron Crum, 1951, where we find how he entered with the psalm, like the gazelle wants to drink, etc. So this is, I think we can put this in relation with the gazelle. Regarding the three young Hebrew in the fiery furnace, surrounded by saints. I don't know what it was, but I think it could be representing the third oath in the Coptic Church, which is followed by the litany of the Memento Sanctorum of the saints. That's why they put saints behind this. So, and we have the actual Psalmodea, we have this, the hymns, and after that, the intercession of the saints. I don't know what you think about. It's just some ideas and so
well, as I said, I think that there is for many of these themes there is not one single reason for representing them. So, for instance, the hymn of the three men, which is also frequently sung in church, is I think a very valid reason for representing them. For instance, also in De La Soulian, the representation on one of the walls. So there it certainly is not in a funerary context. And
no, I'm not talking about funerary context. By the way, also they are represented in the chapel of the Exodus in Karel in Bawit. In the context of the whole oaths of the Old Testament, the 14 oaths of the Old Testament, which are sung in the Bright Sunday, they are represented. So you have the Exodus, you have the three, you have the what's called Isaiah and the martyrdom of Isaiah. You have more or less the 14 oaths of the Old Testament on the ceiling of the Kharga Bhagavad. So yes, it's just an idea. It's not. I'm not saying that this is the truth. It's just idea. What's worse.
Yeah, but as I said, there can be multiple reasons for each of these subjects to be represented, and well, that's why I have put these things in constellation with each other to see that if we are trying to interpret the cell as a tomb, that the occurrence of these themes can reinforce one another, but that by no means each of these subjects and themes has one single meaning in iconography. So, in this respect, I agree with you, I think.
Yes, please.
Michael.
Yes, the problem of the gazelle is that quite a number of these animals are not gazelles at all. They're unicorns.
Unicorns?
Yes. No, really. In the tomb chapel of Chinut, the so-called tomb chapel of Chinut, they're unicorns. In that one in Bawit you shared is a unicorn. Following this unicorn in Shah Said, I wondered why this was a unicorn, and especially it had an inscription, it was a unicorn. Why did we see so little of unicorns in Egypt? In Playa there are a few, also with inscriptions. And then I started to compare this animal, because what is a unicorn? How is it depicted? With gazelles and deer and so on, and found out that quite a number of animals described as gazelles or deers are not gazelles or deers at all, but unicorns. They have only one horn and it is torsaded, or a bit zigzagged.
Well, that would be a good reason to have a closer look at many of these
By the way, there is a lamp in the Coptic Museum with a stand and beautiful 3 unicorns, not horses. Those unicorns. Yeah. So, yeah, 7th century bronze lamp with the base as 3 unicorns rather than horses. Yeah.
Yeah, and the symbol of the unicorn has a double meaning in literature. It can be good, positive, and it can be evil to overcome. It depends on the situation.
But I've noticed other enigmatic details, like for instance the gazelle being attacked by a snake. One of the gazelles, or if it's I don't know if this one was a gazelle or unicorn,
A snake is a gazelle.
the front legs bound together, so to
Yeah, that is one of the problems.
to restrain
They
him,
look very much alike.
for which I don't have an explanation right now. So I think I have to go through my Coptic bestiary once more, and yeah, there's still
But
lots of
it is
questions.
worthwhile to look closely at these animals, because sometimes they're quite different from what you think they are.
Yes, please.
First, I'd like to thank you for the excellent presentation, it's a very informative one. I have a question regarding chapter 12 that you showed early on, where it was depicting some men with a tunic and a knee tunic and pair of pants underneath.
Yes.
This kind of dress, to me, doesn't look like a Coptic style of getting dressed. It's more of maybe a Persian style or something like this. So I was wondering why was it in the Bawit monastery?
Well, if you look at these, I mean, it occurs in the hunting scenes, I think.
Yes.
And of course, it's yes, this one, and of course the show slides. This one, no. Well, and anyway, you can imagine that if you go hunting in a galabia which is up to your ankles, you will be in a problem of when it comes to movement. So what you see here, as well as in the Roman sarcophagus, is that the men who are hunting here are wearing this kind of costume simply because it is giving them more freedom of movement. Yeah, so it would be a sort of leisure dress, while people in under normal circumstances would wear a tunic to their ankles. And that is probably the case both in Egypt and in other parts of the later Roman world.
Many scholars now may think there is a Coptic style or art. There is art of the whole Mediterranean. So this is also, well, we have to wait for more study. More questions? So before we start at first, thank you very much for your presentation. I have two announcements. Number one, regarding the flashback with everything in this symposium, including also the excursion.